The mansion on Haverstone Hill had long forgotten the sound of laughter. Once, it had echoed with it, polished floors reflecting candlelight, music spilling from the drawing room, the faint clinking of champagne glasses during endless soirees. But those were ghosts now, buried beneath years of silence. For Margaret Hale, the housemaid, silence had become both a master and a companion. She rose each morning before dawn, her footsteps soft as breath across the marble corridor. Her hands knew the rhythm of her work by heart, dust the chandeliers, polish the banisters, press the linen till it shone like snow under glass. She was invisible by design, the kind of woman whose presence was felt only in what gleamed after she passed. She never complained. That was not her way. The world had not been kind to her, but it had given her this, a roof, a wage, and something resembling purpose. The mansion staff had dwindled over the years, leaving Margaret as one of the few who still remained faithful. Faithful to the house, to her duties, and perhaps to something deeper, the quiet belief that service, when done with love, was its own kind of grace. Every room had a story, she believed. The kitchen told of long-forgotten warmth, the library whispered of men who had dreamed of power, and the music room, the music room, it was the heart that had stopped beating. The grand piano sat there beneath a white sheet, like a tombstone draped in mourning cloth. Dust gathered along its edges despite Margaret's constant care. Each morning she would dust around it with gentle strokes, never lifting the cover. It was not her place. She'd been told once, years ago by the head butler, before he too had retired, that the piano was not to be touched. Belonged to Madam, he had said, voice low and reverent. After the accident, Mr. Edward ordered it sealed. That was all she knew, and all she needed to know. Still, she felt something stir each time she entered that room. The air was different there, heavier, expectant, like a breath waiting to be released. When the sun hit the tall windows just right, light spilled across the white cloth, tracing the outline of the piano beneath as though trying to wake it. It was on one such morning, years into her quiet service, that the stillness broke. She was dusting the map of Europe above the mantel, her old duster sweeping along the frame. The light from the windows caught the dust motes midair, turning them into flecks of gold. She thought of how pretty it looked, the world shrinking into glittering fragments. For a moment, she smiled, and then her gaze drifted to the piano. Something about it felt different that day. The cloth seemed tighter, the air around it warmer, as though memory itself was pressing from within. She hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of her duster. Her pulse fluttered. It was foolish, she told herself. Foolish to feel drawn to an object, foolish to think sound could bring back what grief had taken. But perhaps foolishness is where humanity begins. Margaret set her duster down. Slowly, as though afraid to wake someone, she stepped toward the piano. Her reflection trembled faintly in the windowpane behind it. The scent of polish and old oak filled her nose. She reached out and touched the corner of the cloth. It was softer than she expected, silk, perhaps. For years, her hands had known only rough fabric, broom handles, and soap. This texture felt almost sacred. Her fingers lingered, then pinched the fabric and lifted. Dust cascaded into the air like a sigh released after too long. Beneath the cloth lay gleaming black wood, dulled by time but still graceful, proud, alive. Margaret's throat tightened. She traced the rim of the keys without pressing them, feeling the cold under her fingertips. She could almost hear it, the echoes of a melody once played here, laughter from a woman she'd never known, perhaps the mistress of the house herself. Her hand hovered over the keys. Just one, she whispered. Just one note. And then she pressed. A soft sound filled the air, faint, hesitant, but impossibly alive. It was as though the mansion exhaled after years of holding its breath. The note hung between the walls, pure and trembling. Margaret froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound faded. Silence returned, but it was a different silence now, one that listened back. Then she felt it, the sensation of being watched. She turned, startled, her eyes darting to the doorway. There, in the dim light, stood Daniel. He was thinner than she remembered, a boy of perhaps 15, pale skin against dark hair, eyes unfocused yet filled with an unearthly stillness. He was the son of Mr. Edward, the master of the house, and the only heir. Blind since the accident that had taken his mother. Margaret had seen him many times in passing, guided by caretakers through the corridors, never speaking, never smiling. He stood there barefoot, head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. She had not spoken to the young master in months, it was not her place. But his stillness unnerved her. "I'm sorry," she murmured instinctively. "I didn't mean to." Daniel lifted his hand. Not to stop her, just to listen. His head turned toward the piano. Margaret hesitated, then pressed another key. A higher note, softer this time. The boy's fingers twitched at his sides. His chin lifted slightly, as though following the sound through the air. Margaret's breath caught. She pressed another note, then another, forming a fragile thread of melody, nothing more than whispers of sound. Daniel took a slow step forward, his hand grazing the doorframe. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, a flicker of recognition, or maybe memory. Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't dare move too quickly. She simply played, 2 notes, then silence, then one again. Daniel's hand rose, trembling. For a brief second, she thought he might reach for her, but he didn't. He simply stood there, bathed in light, facing a sound instead of a person. And for the first time in years, Margaret saw something bloom in his still face, not quite a smile, not yet, but the shadow of life returning. The moment was gone almost as soon as it arrived. Footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor, the caretaker's, perhaps, and Margaret quickly dropped the piano cover, stepping back. Her chest heaved with guilt and wonder. Daniel turned toward the sound of the footsteps but didn't move. He seemed anchored there, as if afraid that leaving might make the music vanish. Margaret, her hands still trembling, whispered under her breath, "Forgive me, madam. I think your son heard you today." Then she picked up her duster again and slipped quietly from the room, the faint vibration of that single note still ringing in her bones. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed beneath the servants' quarters, the melody replayed in her mind. 1 note. 2. Silence. It was foolish, she told herself again. But something in her heart whispered differently. That sound had not only stirred the mansion, it had awakened something inside her too. Somewhere, between dust and silence, she had found the faintest spark of hope. And though she did not yet know it, that single note would soon change everything, for her, for the boy, and for the house that had forgotten how to feel. The following morning dawned gray and soundless, the kind of morning that swallowed color before it reached the earth. Margaret moved through the mansion as she always did, silent, steady, invisible. But inside her, something had changed. Sleep had not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it, the faint tremor of that single note echoing through the stillness. She'd told herself it was foolish to think one sound could shift the air of an entire home, yet the feeling lingered. The house felt, alert now, like an old animal waking after a long hibernation. In the corridor outside the music room, she hesitated. Her duster was clutched to her chest like a shield. She told herself she was only passing through, that she would not be reckless again. But when her eyes met the piano room door, her breath caught. The lock was undone. That small detail froze her where she stood. Mr. Edwards' orders had been clear years ago: the music room stays closed. Always. Only the caretaker carried a key. Yet now the door was unlatched, just enough to reveal a thin stripe of morning light slanting across the floor. Margaret's heart thudded painfully. She pushed the door open a fraction wider. And there he was, Daniel, standing before the piano like a pilgrim before an altar. He wore the same soft gray sweater he always did, his dark hair uncombed, his eyes half open but unseeing. His hands hovered uncertainly above the covered instrument. For a moment, Margaret didn't move. She feared startling him, or worse, being seen by one of the other staff. But something in his stillness rooted her to the spot. Then, slowly, Daniel lowered his right hand and pressed the white cloth where the keys slept beneath. No sound came, of course, but his expression, it changed. His lips parted faintly, a whisper of longing crossing his face. Margaret stepped inside before she could stop herself. "Good morning, Master Daniel," she said softly, her voice like a ripple in still water. He turned toward her voice, not directly, but close enough to show he recognized her presence. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, as if reaching through darkness for the memory of sound. She began, then stopped. What could she say? "I'm sorry for yesterday. I shouldn't have played." The words felt small next to the truth she carried. Instead, she said the only thing that felt right. "Would you like to hear it again?" For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. His head tilted toward the piano, then toward her. Then, so faintly she almost missed it, he nodded. That single motion, a boy who had lived in silence choosing to say yes, hit her like sunlight through stained glass. Margaret closed the door behind her, heart pounding. She crossed to the piano, her fingers trembling as she folded back the cloth once more. Dust puffed into the air like breath from old lungs. The piano gleamed in the soft light, waiting. She took a seat on the bench, smoothed her apron, and pressed one key. A clear note drifted out, delicate as glass. Daniel's head turned instantly toward it. His lips parted in astonishment. She played another, lower this time. He stepped closer, cautious but eager. His hand reached out until his fingers brushed the edge of the wood. "Here," she murmured, guiding his hand forward. "This is where sound lives." Daniel's palm trembled beneath hers. She guided one finger down onto a key, and when the note sang out, his whole body stiffened. Then, slowly, a small exhale escaped him, a sound that was almost a laugh. Margaret's eyes burned. "That's it," she whispered. "That's music." He pressed another key, softer now, then another. Each sound seemed to pull something from him, something lost and returning in fragments. His face tilted toward the ceiling, toward the direction of sound itself. It was as if he were seeing light through his ears. She sat beside him, her own hands trembling. Together they created small, hesitant patterns, a lullaby in pieces. Margaret had no training beyond what she'd overheard from the mansion's musicians years ago, but she played by instinct, letting feeling guide her fingers. Daniel followed, matching her rhythm clumsily but with astonishing hunger. When she paused, he stilled. When she resumed, he moved again. He was listening not just with his ears but with his skin. His fingertips rested against the keys long after each note had faded, absorbing the faint vibration through the wood. Margaret realized, with awe, that the boy wasn't simply hearing music. He was feeling it, mapping sound like a blind man mapping sunlight on his face. Minutes passed like moments. They said nothing. They didn't have to. And then it happened. Daniel struck two notes together, hesitantly, awkwardly, but the sound that followed carried a strange grace. He paused, then tried again, correcting his pressure. The second time, it sounded intentional. Margaret smiled. "Beautiful," she whispered. The word hung in the air, and for the first time, Daniel seemed to understand it. He didn't smile back exactly, but a faint warmth softened his face. Outside, the clock struck 10. The chime startled them both. Daniel flinched and turned his head sharply toward the door. Heavy footsteps approached, his caretakers, brisk and methodical. "Master Daniel," the woman called, pushing open the door. She froze at the sight. "Margaret. What on earth?" Margaret rose immediately, heart hammering. "He asked for music," she said quickly, bowing her head. "Only a few notes. Please don't." The caretaker's eyes darted from her to the boy. Daniel stood motionless beside the piano, his hands still resting on the edge. But then something extraordinary happened. Daniel lifted his hand and pointed, not at the door, not at the caretaker, but at the piano. The caretaker blinked. In all her years with him, Daniel had never gestured toward anything. Not once. His finger trembled, but it was clear. He wanted the piano. He wanted sound. The caretaker's mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes softened with confusion, maybe even wonder. "Well," she murmured after a pause, I'll inform your father." When she left, the silence that returned was no longer oppressive. It was charged with something new, possibility. Margaret sat again, her heart still racing. "You did that," she whispered to Daniel. "You asked for it." He tilted his head toward her, and though his lips never formed words, the meaning was clear. "Thank you." That afternoon, Margaret worked in the kitchen, folding linen napkins into perfect squares. Yet her thoughts never left the music room. She felt something shift within her, not pride, not even joy, but reverence. The boy she had pitied had just taught her something she'd forgotten long ago, that even silence has a heartbeat if you dare to listen closely enough. Later, as she passed the hallway again, she noticed the music room door still slightly ajar. A faint draft carried the scent of polished wood and something sweeter, hope, perhaps. For the first time in years, Margaret smiled while she worked. She did not yet know how fragile that hope was, or how easily it could be taken from them. But for now, it was enough. Because in a house that had known only silence, a blind boy had just heard light. And a humble maid, unseen and uncelebrated, had become its keeper. The mornings that followed felt unlike any Margaret had ever known. The mansion still stirred with the same routines, the hiss of the kettle in the kitchen, the faint clatter of silverware being arranged, the murmur of distant footsteps across marble, but beneath it all pulsed something new. Hope. Small, trembling, but alive. Every dawn she woke before the bells, washed her face in cold water, and found her hands already reaching for her apron. The air outside her quarters felt sharper now, fresher, as if the house itself had begun to breathe again. Daniel's caretaker no longer questioned her presence near the piano room. Perhaps she sensed the boy's change too, the faint color returning to his pale cheeks, the quicker steps when he was guided down the corridor each morning. Whatever the reason, Margaret was left unbothered. And so, before the rest of the staff awoke, she began to slip quietly into the music room. Each time, she found Daniel already there. He seemed to sense her arrival long before her footsteps reached him. He would stand by the piano, one hand resting lightly on its surface, head tilted in anticipation. They never spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence had become its own language. Margaret would remove the white cloth carefully, folding it as though it were sacred linen. The dust that once gathered thickly no longer dared to settle. When her fingers brushed the keys, she felt no fear now, only reverence. She began with simple notes, low and warm, the kind that filled the room like sunrise. Daniel listened with his whole body, the sound reflecting softly off his face. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, she guided his hands to the keys. "Feel it," she whispered once. "Don't think of what it should be. Let it tell you." Daniel's hands trembled. The first time, his touch was too firm, the note harsh and uneven. He winced. But Margaret smiled gently. "Try again," she murmured. He did. And again. And again. Each attempt softened, became more deliberate, until the piano began to hum beneath his fingertips, responding to his patience. He couldn't see, but he learned to listen to the echoes, the tiny resonances that told him whether he'd struck too hard or too soft. To Margaret, it was a miracle unfolding in real time. The boy who had once lived inside a fortress of silence was learning to speak through sound. Days became weeks, and the lessons deepened. She no longer played just for him, she played with him. Sometimes she led with quiet chords, and he followed like a shadow tracing the edge of light. Other times, he would reach first, striking two keys that didn't belong together, yet somehow, when she answered with her own, the chaos found rhythm. They were composing something wordless but deeply human, a conversation between two souls who had no other way to speak. Margaret began to notice small changes in Daniel's face. His expression, once vacant, began to flicker with thought, curiosity, even emotion. Sometimes his brow furrowed when a chord displeased him. Other times, a faint smile ghosted across his lips when they found harmony. But the most unforgettable morning came when he played his first sound entirely on his own. It was raining outside, a soft, steady drizzle tapping against the window panes. Margaret had been polishing the brass lamp when Daniel, sitting quietly at the piano, pressed 3 keys in sequence. They weren't perfect, one too sharp, one delayed, but together they made something beautiful, something fragile. Margaret froze, watching him. He repeated the notes, slower this time, as if testing the air. Then again, faster. Then he stopped, head bowed, listening to the way the last vibration dissolved into silence. And then, he smiled. Not the hesitant curl of lips he'd shown before, but a real, unguarded smile. It lit his face like dawn breaking over a dark sea. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She didn't speak. She simply pressed her hand against her chest, holding in the ache of joy. It wasn't just music anymore. It was awakening. After that day, she began keeping a small notebook tucked inside her apron. In it, she wrote down the sequences they discovered together, notes that meant calm, remember, light. She couldn't read or write music properly, but she invented her own way, drawing shapes and symbols that captured the feeling of each sound. Sometimes Daniel's hands brushed the paper as if trying to sense what she'd written. When he played afterward, the notes often matched her sketches uncannily. It was as though he understood emotions before logic, tone before language. Margaret began to wonder whether his blindness wasn't a curse, but a strange kind of gift, the ability to hear the world the way others could not. Yet amid this growing wonder, fear shadowed her heart. She knew Edward, Daniel's father, was a man of rules, order, and precision. He believed in doctors, not miracles. Routines, not risks. If he discovered that a servant had broken the silence he had built around his son, she knew the price. Still, she could not stop. Every time Daniel's hands found new notes, she saw more life return to his face, and she told herself that no punishment could be worse than denying him that spark. Some afternoons, while dusting the library, she caught glimpses of Edward pacing through the halls, his posture rigid, his expression hollow. The grief he carried was like a shadow stitched to his frame. She often wondered if he remembered how to feel. One day, as she passed the study, she heard him speaking to the caretaker in a clipped tone. "The boy still refuses his therapy sessions?" "Yes, sir," came the reply. "He sits by the window mostly. But, he seems calmer." Edward's voice hardened. "Calm is not progress." Margaret pressed her back to the wall, heart pounding. She knew what he would say next, and she feared it. But instead, after a long pause, she heard the softest change in his tone, confusion, maybe even hope. "He hums sometimes now." "I've heard it." "Yes," the caretaker said. "Little sounds, sir. Like music." Music. The word lingered in the air. Margaret fled before she could hear more, clutching her apron to her chest. That evening, as she prepared the silver trays for dinner, she felt Daniel's faint melody echoing through her mind. The boy's courage reminded her of something she had long buried, the belief that even those who serve in silence can change the course of a life. After all, what greater act of service was there than helping someone rediscover their soul? The next morning, she entered the music room to find Daniel waiting again. He was smiling faintly, his fingers already poised over the keys. She joined him, their hands side by side, the faint morning light catching the edges of the piano like a halo. This time, she didn't guide him. She didn't need to. He found his own melody, a delicate chain of notes that drifted upward like prayer. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. There were no words. There didn't need to be. Because sometimes, the truest conversations in life are not spoken, they are felt. And in that grand, quiet mansion, a maid and a blind boy were speaking louder than anyone had in years. The rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and heavy, as though the world itself hadn't quite decided whether to move on from its sorrow. Inside the mansion, morning routines resumed with mechanical precision, trays of breakfast rolled across marble floors, fireplaces crackled to life, and the smell of polish and roasted coffee filled the air. For most of the household, it was a day like any other. But for Edward Whitmore, the master of the estate, something in that familiar order felt slightly off. He noticed it first in the smallest things. His son lingered at breakfast instead of withdrawing early. The boy's usual vacant stare had changed, there was focus now, a stillness that suggested thought. When the caretaker guided him to the garden, Daniel paused mid-step, as though listening to something beneath the surface of sound itself. Edward frowned at his ledger, though he wasn't reading it. The columns of numbers blurred. For the first time in years, distraction crept through the cracks of his self-imposed control. He closed the book sharply and stood. In the years following his wife's death, Edward had built his world from order and silence. Rules were safety. Schedules were salvation. Every minute of Daniel's life was accounted for, therapy, rest, diet, all arranged with clockwork precision. Grief, he believed, could be managed if it were measured. But lately, things were shifting. He told himself it was nothing, a coincidence, perhaps. Still, unease crept into him. He decided to review the mansion's security footage. Edward rarely entered the monitoring room anymore. It reminded him of the night of the accident, when screens had flickered with chaos and police lights. But old habits returned easily. He sat down at the console, pressed a few keys, and the timeline began to scroll across the monitors, rows of quiet hours captured in grayscale. Most of it was mundane. Corridors empty. Staff moving through hallways. The faint glint of dawn reflecting on polished marble. Then something caught his eye. At 6:47 a.m., the music room door opened. He leaned forward. Daniel appeared, barefoot, still in his nightshirt, stepping hesitantly inside. Moments later, Margaret entered. The camera's angle caught her only in fragments, her hands, the hem of her apron, the glimmer of dust motes rising as she uncovered the piano. Edward froze the frame. His jaw tightened. He hadn't seen that piano uncovered in almost a decade. It had belonged to his wife, Lydia, the only thing she loved enough to fight him over. He had locked it the day they buried her. He had sworn the house would never hear its music again. And yet here it was, open, alive. He pressed play. The footage was silent, but he didn't need sound to understand. He saw the way Daniel's hands hovered over the keys, how the boy's shoulders relaxed, how his mouth moved in small, silent patterns, as if he were breathing differently. Edward watched for several minutes, transfixed. Margaret played softly, Daniel listening, touching, learning. He looked alive. Alive. That word struck him like a blow. He wanted to feel gratitude, but instead something darker rose inside him. Fear. Fear of what this meant, this breaking of his fragile system, this intrusion of unpredictability. He had spent years ensuring his son's world was contained, safe, structured. Music was not order. It was emotion. And emotion had destroyed them once before. He slammed the console shut and sat in silence. For the rest of the day, Edward could not concentrate. He went through the motions, signing letters, reviewing accounts, but every so often, that image of his son sitting at the piano returned to him. His wife's ghost seemed to whisper in the walls, "He's waking up, Edward. Don't stop him." By evening, he could no longer bear it. He summoned Margaret to his study. When she entered, the fire was already lit, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill in the room. She stood before his desk, her hands clasped nervously in front of her apron. "You sent for me, sir." Edward's voice was steady but cold. "I did." "Sit." She hesitated, then obeyed. The sound of the chair legs scraping across the floor echoed unnaturally loud. He folded his hands on the desk. "You've been working here how long?" "Almost 10 years, sir." He nodded. "Faithful service. I've had no reason to doubt your diligence." He paused, then leaned forward. "Until now." Margaret's stomach sank. "Sir." He reached for the remote beside him and turned the monitor on. The paused image of her and Daniel filled the small screen. "You recognize this?" Her breath caught. There was no point denying it. "Yes, sir." He pressed play for a few seconds, the piano cover lifting, Daniel leaning in, and then stopped it again. "What exactly do you think you were doing?" he asked, each word clipped with precision. Margaret swallowed hard. "Helping him, sir." "Helping him?" His tone sharpened. "By defying a direct order. That piano was sealed for a reason. You had no right to interfere." She met his gaze, not defiant, but steady. "He wasn't breaking, sir. He was healing." Edward's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "You presume to know what my son needs better than I do." "I don't presume, sir," she said quietly. "I saw it." He responded. He smiled. The words hung in the air like forbidden scripture. Edward stood abruptly. "Enough." He turned away, staring into the fire. "You think you've done something noble. You haven't. You've stirred things best left buried." "Sir," she whispered, "your wife's music still lives in him. You can't silence that." His shoulders tensed. For a heartbeat, she thought he might turn and agree, might finally allow the dam to break. But instead, his voice came out colder than before. "This ends now. You are dismissed." The words fell with the finality of a gavel. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came. She rose slowly, her face pale. "Please, sir. Don't take this from him. It's the first time he's felt." "Enough!" Edward roared. His voice echoed through the room, sharp and brittle. "You will not speak of my son again. You will collect your things and leave this house before sunrise." Margaret flinched, then nodded. Her throat ached as she whispered, "Yes, sir." When she left, Edward sank back into his chair. The fire crackled softly, the only witness to his unraveling. He pressed his palms over his eyes, trying to steady his breath, but the silence felt suffocating. Down the hall, in the music room, Daniel sat alone. The piano was locked, its white cloth drawn tight again. He ran his hands along the edge, searching for sound. None came. For the boy who had just begun to rediscover life, the silence felt like a wound reopening. He waited there for hours, expecting footsteps that never came. The room grew dark. Still, he waited, because he didn't understand that sometimes, grown-ups confuse control with care, and fear with love. By midnight, the mansion had gone still again. Order had been restored. But it was an order built on grief, and behind its perfect walls, the echoes of a song still trembled, waiting for courage to find them again. The morning after Margaret's dismissal, the mansion felt hollow again. The walls, once trembling faintly with music, seemed to sag under the return of stillness. Even the staff moved differently, quieter, subdued, as if they too could sense that something fragile had been broken. Edward told himself he had done the right thing. Discipline, he reasoned, was mercy. Order protected his son from the chaos that had destroyed their lives once before. The maid's interference had been reckless. Dangerous. Emotional. And yet, he could not stop hearing the echo of that word. He smiled. Margaret's voice haunted him. Edward sat at his desk long after breakfast, staring at his reflection in the polished surface. Outside his window, the winter garden drooped beneath a gray sky. The fountain had frozen over in the night, a white crust of ice sealing its motion, its music. It reminded him of Daniel. He told himself not to look. Not to go near the music room. But at dusk, drawn by something heavier than curiosity, he found himself walking down the corridor toward it. The air grew colder near that part of the house. The scent of varnish and old velvet lingered. When he reached the door, his hand paused on the knob. Through the small crack beneath it, faint light glowed. The caretaker must have left a lamp inside. He hesitated, then turned the key and stepped in. Daniel was sitting on the floor beside the piano, back against the wood, legs pulled close to his chest. The white cloth hung tight over the keys like a shroud. Edward froze. He hadn't known the boy was there. "Daniel," he said softly. His son didn't respond. Edward moved closer, the faint creak of his shoes echoing across the marble. He crouched beside him. The boy's hands were flat on the cloth, tracing the shape of the covered keys, searching for the sounds he could no longer find. "Daniel," Edward repeated, his voice tightening. "It's late. You should be in bed." Still, the boy said nothing. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. His fingers pressed harder against the cloth, as if trying to force sound from silence. Edward's chest constricted. "Enough," he murmured. He reached forward, gently prying Daniel's hands away. The boy resisted, weakly, but enough to make Edward's throat ache. He gathered Daniel into his arms, the way he hadn't since he was small. The boy didn't struggle now, he simply sagged against him, limp, defeated. Edward carried him upstairs, the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the empty hall like an accusation. When he laid Daniel in bed, he noticed something that pierced him. His son's lips were moving faintly, mouthing something soundless. It took Edward a moment to realize he was mimicking notes, repeating fragments of melodies that no longer existed. He sat there until the boy fell asleep, the room dim except for the lamp's small circle of light. Then he rose, turned it off, and left in silence. Days passed, and the mansion began to suffocate under its own quiet. Daniel no longer spoke, no longer ate with interest. He followed his caretaker's instructions, but like a ghost rehearsing a role. His steps slowed. His appetite faded. His hands, those once so alive upon the piano, now hung at his sides. Margaret's absence was a wound that no one dared name. Even Edward noticed the shift. The logs he kept of Daniel's behavior grew shorter, meals untouched. Therapy incomplete. Sleep irregular. But he didn't write what truly mattered, that every night, Daniel found his way back to the music room and sat at the locked piano until morning. The servants whispered of it. The boy haunting the corridors, the echo of fingers brushing cloth where notes used to live. Edward heard them and said nothing. He wanted to believe it was just gossip. But guilt began to gnaw at him. One night, restless, he wandered into his wife's old storage room, a place he hadn't entered in years. The smell of cedar and old paper filled the air. Dust lay thick upon the boxes. He opened one, then another, clothing, photo albums, stacks of music sheets yellowed with time. The handwriting on them stopped him cold. Lydia's. Her looping script danced across the margins with notes and small phrases. Lightly, let him feel the sound, music isn't heard, it's touched. Edward sat down hard on the edge of a wooden chest. He remembered the night Lydia had tried to teach Daniel piano, before the accident. The boy was 5, small hands fumbling over the keys, Lydia laughing softly. Edward had stood in the doorway then too, arms folded, impatient. He needs discipline, he had said. Not distraction. She had smiled sadly. He needs both. One keeps him alive, Edward. The other makes him human. Now, years later, he saw the truth in every word. He reached for another sheet. Beneath it was a folded page, brittle and worn. The handwriting made his pulse stutter. If he ever stops listening, it read, find someone who can teach him to feel. Edward's vision blurred. He clutched the page as though it might vanish. Lydia had known this moment would come. She had left him a map, and he had ignored it, until now. For the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to break. His shoulders shook. The sound of his grief filled the room that had not known a heartbeat since her death. He pressed the letter to his forehead. "Oh, Lydia," he whispered. "What have I done?" When he finally rose, dawn had begun to bleed through the curtains. That morning, Edward left the mansion for the first time in months. The staff stared as he walked past them, coat unbuttoned, eyes hollow but determined. He drove without thinking, through the city, past the bridges, until he reached a modest neighborhood on the outskirts. The address he'd found in Margaret's file wasn't hard to locate. A small brick house, white curtains in the window, a potted plant on the step. It looked impossibly ordinary, nothing like the world he had built behind stone gates. He stood on the porch for several minutes, the winter air sharp in his lungs. His pride warred with his guilt, each heartbeat echoing like thunder in his chest. Then the door opened. Margaret stood there, wearing a plain sweater and an expression caught between surprise and caution. Her hands were still damp from washing dishes. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have come." Edward removed his hat. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a master addressing a servant, it was the voice of a man who had finally run out of walls to hide behind. "I was wrong." The words hung there, fragile and astonishing. Margaret said nothing. He continued, his tone breaking. "I thought I was protecting him. But I wasn't. I was afraid of losing him the way I lost her. Of seeing him hurt again." He drew a shaky breath. "But she left me a letter. My wife. She said, if he ever stopped listening, find someone who can teach him to feel." Margaret's eyes filled with quiet tears. Edward swallowed hard. "That someone was you, wasn't it?" She looked down. "I was only doing what any mother would have done," she whispered. "He just needed someone to listen." Edward's hands trembled. "Will you come back?" For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, the rhythm of two lives balancing on the edge of forgiveness. Finally, Margaret stepped aside, leaving the door open. "Not for you, sir," she said softly. "For him." Edward nodded once, his throat too tight for words. He crossed the threshold. And as the door closed behind them, somewhere far away, the frozen fountain at Haverstone Hill began to crack, ice melting under the first warmth of morning. The mansion greeted her return not with applause, but with silence, the kind that holds its breath before the first note of a song. Margaret stepped through the tall oak doors just after sunrise. Frost still rimmed the garden walls, and the air was brittle enough to sting her lungs. She paused in the entrance hall, fingers tightening around the handle of her small cloth bag. Every detail of the house was as she remembered, the faint echo of her own footsteps, the glint of brass along the staircase, the scent of polish and dust mingled together. Yet something felt different, as if the walls themselves were listening. Edward stood waiting by the foot of the grand staircase. He wasn't the man she remembered from that night in his study. The armor of authority had cracked. His face looked older, not from years, but from the weight of remorse. The hard set of his jaw had softened, his eyes, once cold, now carried the exhaustion of someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be unbreakable. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, an unspoken apology, a request, a surrender. Margaret returned the gesture, equally wordless. Their silence was not awkward. It was sacred. Without waiting for instruction, she turned toward the west corridor. Her shoes clicked softly against the marble, a rhythm she had missed without realizing it. As she passed the portraits of long-dead ancestors, the golden morning light spilled through the tall windows, warming the edges of her path. When she reached the music room, she hesitated. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the brass handle. Edward followed her but stopped just behind, leaving space, as if acknowledging that what lay beyond this door belonged not to him, but to something greater. Margaret drew a breath, turned the key, and pushed the door open. Light poured into the room, soft and forgiving. Dust danced in golden shafts where the curtains shifted in the draft. The piano stood at the center, draped in its white cloth once again. Solemn but waiting. And there, seated on the bench, perfectly still, was Daniel. He was thinner than before, his hair longer, the edges of his face sharper from sleepless nights. Yet when Margaret entered, he lifted his head instantly, his blind eyes searching the air. He didn't need to see her. He knew. "Good morning, Master Daniel," she whispered, her voice catching. He tilted his face toward her voice. His lips parted, not to speak, but to breathe differently, as if sound itself had changed the air. Edward's hand tightened around the doorframe behind them. He stayed there, saying nothing, the observer now instead of the ruler. Margaret crossed the room slowly, her footsteps deliberate, reverent. She reached the piano, hesitated, then peeled back the cloth. The gleaming black wood emerged from its shroud. Her reflection trembled faintly in the polished surface. Daniel's hands rose at once, hovering above the keys but not yet daring to touch. She sat beside him. The bench creaked softly beneath their weight. Her fingers found their familiar place. For a moment, neither moved. Then, very softly, she pressed one key. The note bloomed into the air like a sigh long withheld. Daniel flinched, then froze. His breathing quickened. He pressed a key beside hers. The harmony, imperfect but alive, filled the room. The mansion listened. They played together without words. Margaret's hands wove slow, steady patterns, gentle enough for him to follow, sure enough for him to trust. Daniel responded like a bird relearning flight, hesitant at first, then freer. Edward took a step forward, his throat tightening. The sound, faint and fragile, reached him like sunlight through cracked glass. He hadn't realized how much he missed it, the echo of life in this house. Margaret glanced at him briefly. His eyes glistened, though he didn't notice. Daniel paused suddenly. His fingers hovered midair. "Try it with 3 notes, Margaret," whispered gently, remembering something his mother had once written in a margin. "Teach him to feel through 3s, his heart understands patterns before his mind does." Daniel pressed 3 keys together, unsteady, uneven. He frowned slightly, then tried again. This time, the sound came smoother, deliberate. Margaret smiled through the tears welling in her eyes. But what happened next silenced them both. Daniel tilted his head and said, in a voice thin with disuse but clear as dawn, "This was Mom's song, wasn't it?" The world seemed to stop. Margaret's hands froze over the keys. Her breath caught. She turned toward him, but her throat refused sound. Behind them, Edward swayed as if struck. For years he had prayed for this, to hear his son's voice again, but now that it had arrived, he couldn't bear its purity. It was his wife's echo, her melody, her ghost threading through their child's fragile voice. Yes, Margaret whispered finally, her voice trembling. It was. Daniel didn't move. He played the 3 notes again, slower this time, softer, as though speaking to the air around him. The melody hung like memory. Edward covered his mouth with his hand, his breath breaking. He sank into the nearest chair, shoulders shaking, eyes wet. For the first time in his life, he didn't hide the sound of his tears. Margaret's gaze softened. She turned back to the piano, her fingers joining Daniel's. Together they played the rest of the sequence, simple, imperfect, human. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was holy. Edward rose slowly and walked toward them. The room smelled faintly of dust and mourning. Daniel didn't turn, he didn't need to, but Edward stopped behind him and placed a trembling hand on his son's shoulder. Daniel stilled. Then, for the first time in years, he leaned back ever so slightly into his father's touch. No words. No apology. No speeches. Just presence. Edward closed his eyes. For so long, he had built walls around grief, thinking they would protect him. But walls keep everything out, even love. And now, standing behind his son, listening to the faint hum still vibrating in the strings of that piano, he understood what Margaret and Lydia had both known all along, that healing begins when you stop trying to control how it should sound. He knelt beside his son and whispered hoarsely, "Play it again." Daniel smiled faintly. With her. Edward looked up at Margaret, who was already nodding through quiet tears. And so they began again, 3 notes, a pause, then 3 more. Edward stayed beside them, one hand on the piano's edge, feeling the vibrations run through the wood into his skin. Each note loosened the grip of his old grief a little more. By the time they finished, light had fully filled the room. The frost on the windows had begun to melt, dripping in thin trails that shimmered like liquid glass. Daniel turned his face toward the light. "It feels warm," he said softly. Margaret smiled. "That's because it is." Edward's voice broke. "And it's because of you, Margaret." She looked at him, not as a servant to a master, but as one soul to another. "No, sir," she said gently. "It's because of him. He never stopped listening. He just needed someone to help him hear again." Edward nodded slowly, unable to speak. His gaze drifted between them, his son, radiant with newfound calm, and the woman who had brought life back to his home. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't alone in his own house. And as the morning light spread across the marble, illuminating the once locked piano, Edward knew one simple, humbling truth. Sometimes, redemption doesn't enter through grand gestures or great power, it arrives quietly, carried in the hands of someone the world never thought to thank. The door to the music room remained open that day. And this time, no one would ever close it again. Morning came quietly, diffused through pale curtains and the faint hum of wind pressing against the windows. In the music room, the piano waited uncovered. For the first time in years, it stood not as an ornament of grief but as a living presence, a voice that had re-entered the house like sunlight through an unlatched window. Daniel was already there, sitting cross-legged on the rug beside the instrument. His fingers traced invisible shapes on the floor, as if drawing melodies no one else could see. When Margaret entered, carrying a small notebook pressed to her chest, he turned his face toward her instantly. "Good morning," she whispered. Daniel smiled, small, hesitant, but real. You came early. She blinked back warmth that rose behind her eyes. I couldn't wait. She crossed to the piano, setting her notebook on the stand. Inside were fragments of their shared language, curved lines, circles, and symbols she'd invented to capture the feelings of each tone. None of it would make sense to anyone else, but to Daniel, it was a map of memory. He lifted his hands to the keys and pressed two notes together, then paused, frowning slightly. Too heavy, he murmured. Margaret leaned closer. Try the octave instead. Let the air between them breathe. He adjusted, struck the higher note, and the room filled with a gentler resonance. It hovered and settled, finding balance. She smiled. That's the sound of morning. Daniel tilted his head. It feels golden. The phrasing startled her, it was exactly how his mother had once described her music. It feels golden. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. Yes, golden. Keep that. Behind them, Edward lingered in the doorway. He had stopped wearing his suit jackets around the house. Today he stood in a wool sweater, sleeves rolled, hands loosely clasped. The transformation in him was quiet but profound. He no longer entered rooms like a man demanding order, he entered as someone learning to listen. He watched his son's fingers glide across the keys, tentative but sure. Each sound was a step back toward the light Lydia had left behind. Daniel's tune was halting at first, small clusters of notes stitched together by silence. But gradually, the spaces between them grew shorter, filled with courage. Margaret added soft chords beneath his melody, grounding it. The sound spread through the house like perfume, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Servants paused in the corridors, one of the cooks wiped her eyes with the edge of her apron. Even the old butler, who claimed music was unproductive noise, stopped halfway through polishing the silver and whispered, "It's her song again." Edward moved closer, sitting on the edge of the window seat. His eyes closed. He could almost hear Lydia humming along, that same lightness that used to fill the air when she walked through the garden barefoot. When the last chord faded, Daniel exhaled, trembling slightly. "It's different every time," he said. "That's what makes it alive," Margaret replied softly. He touched the keys again, this time slower, almost meditative. "It's like breathing, isn't it?" She smiled. "Exactly." Edward's voice, low and unused to gentleness, joined theirs. "Breathing is what I forgot to do." Margaret looked over her shoulder. "Then remember now, sir." He nodded, meeting her gaze with humility. Days began to fall into rhythm again, but it was a new rhythm, one not built on rules or timetables but on music. Every morning, Daniel and Margaret practiced. Edward joined them more often, sitting quietly in the back with a cup of tea that always went cold because he was too entranced to drink it. Daniel began to compose small pieces of his own. Margaret recorded each one in her notebook, labeling them not with formal titles but with single words that captured their mood: remember, blue, quiet, dawn. When he played blue, the notes rippled like water. When he played quiet, they landed like falling leaves. And when he played remember, Edward had to turn away, because the melody sounded like the heartbeat of a memory too fragile to touch. One evening, after Daniel had gone to rest, Edward found Margaret in the library, her notebook open beside a candle. "May I?" he asked. She looked up, startled. "Of course." He picked up the notebook and traced the unfamiliar symbols with his finger. "You've given him language again," he murmured. "And you gave it to me, too." Margaret shook her head. "I only showed him where the keys were." The music was always his. Edward closed the notebook carefully. You don't understand. I built this house on silence, thinking it was strength. You reminded me that silence can be cruelty. She hesitated, then said softly, grief makes us mistake stillness for control. But sometimes the only way forward is through noise, the messy, human kind. Edward smiled faintly. You sound like her. I'm sorry, Margaret said, lowering her eyes. I didn't mean to. No, he interrupted gently. Thank you. A week later, Margaret entered the music room to find Edward already there, standing beside Daniel, who was frowning at the keys. What's troubling you? She asked. Daniel turned toward her. I can hear it in my head, but it disappears when I try to play it. Maybe it's too big for the piano, she teased softly. He smiled. Then I'll make it fit. Edward stepped back, giving him space. Margaret sat beside him and began to hum a faint progression of tones. Daniel caught on instantly, matching her pitch, letting her hum guide his hands. The melody that emerged was neither Lydia's nor Margaret's, it was Daniel's. Something wholly his own, delicate yet full of quiet strength. Edward felt his throat close. The boy who had once lived behind walls of grief now filled the air with something sacred. When the piece ended, Margaret exhaled slowly. What will you call it? Daniel thought for a moment. Return, he said. Margaret smiled. Perfect. Edward's voice was rough. With pride. Your mother would be proud, son. Daniel turned his face toward the sound. She's listening, isn't she? Edward nodded, his eyes glistening. Always. For a long moment, none of them moved. The sunlight from the tall windows fell across the piano, turning its surface into a mirror of gold and shadow. Daniel's reflection shimmered beside Margaret's, two souls connected not by sight but by sound. Edward stood there quietly, realizing something profound, that healing isn't a single moment of forgiveness, it's the choice to keep returning to love, even when fear tries to lock the door again. That night, when the household settled into sleep, Edward walked the halls alone. He stopped outside the music room, where faint echoes of Daniel's earlier melody still seemed to linger in the air. He turned off the lamp but left the door ajar. The gesture felt symbolic, an open door where once there had been only locks. He stood there for a long time, eyes closed, listening. The mansion was quiet, but not the suffocating kind of quiet he had built years ago. It was a living silence, the kind that follows the end of a beautiful song. Upstairs, Margaret's light was still on. She sat by her small desk, writing one last note in her book, Return, the Sound of Forgiveness. Below her, Edward whispered into the dark, Thank you, Lydia, and thank you, Margaret. In the soft distance, Daniel's door creaked open. The boy's voice floated down the corridor, fragile but steady. Good night, Dad. Edward froze. For the first time in almost a decade, his son had spoken those words. He closed his eyes and answered through a trembling smile, Good night, son. And somewhere in the heart of the house, the piano, unplayed yet resonant, seemed to hum faintly in the dark, like memory made eternal. The invitation came printed on ivory paper with gold lettering so delicate it looked almost translucent in the light. It wasn't grand or ostentatious, just simple words that carried more meaning than any of them could express aloud. Student Recital, March 12th, Royal Conservatory of Music. Performer, Daniel Whitmore. Margaret read the card twice before she believed it was real. She found it tucked beneath her breakfast tray one morning, the ink still fresh. When she looked up from it, Edward was standing in the doorway, a small smile softening the edges of his normally reserved expression. "He's ready," Edward said simply. Margaret pressed the invitation to her heart. She wanted to speak, but her voice failed. She nodded instead, the corners of her mouth trembling upward. The weeks that followed moved like a quiet storm of preparation. Every day, Daniel practiced at the piano as though time itself were waiting to hear him. His fingers no longer trembled, they spoke. His compositions were no longer hesitant, they were deliberate, sincere. Margaret sat beside him, sometimes playing, sometimes listening, always ready with a word of reassurance when his confidence faltered. Edward, once the silent overseer, now became the steady pillar at the back of the room. He no longer corrected, no longer measured progress in charts or time. He learned to listen. He often found himself watching not the keys, but his son's hands, the graceful arcs they formed, the way his brow furrowed when he reached for emotion instead of perfection. And late at night, when the rest of the mansion slept, Edward would pass by the music room and pause at the door. Daniel's final notes would linger faintly in the air, fading into silence that no longer felt empty. The house was no longer haunted by loss. It breathed again. The day of the recital arrived beneath a pale spring sky. The city shimmered with a hint of rain, the kind that blurs edges and makes everything seem softer, more forgiving. The Royal Conservatory stood like an ancient cathedral of sound, arched windows, marble steps, echoes of generations of music within its walls. Edward had not entered a hall like this since Lydia's last performance. The memory alone made his heart twist. But when he looked at his son, standing calmly near the stage doors, dressed in a simple charcoal suit, hands folded before him, he felt something Lydia had once promised him would return someday. Peace. Margaret joined them, her hair pinned neatly beneath her hat, her notebook clutched in one hand. Edward glanced at her. Nervous? She smiled faintly. For him, always. For us, never. Daniel turned his head toward their voices. Are you both here? Edward stepped forward and touched his shoulder. We're right beside you. Daniel nodded once. Then I'm ready. The small auditorium filled slowly, 40, maybe 50 guests. No grand crowd, no press, no grandeur. Just quiet people sitting in rows, the hush of anticipation settling over them. When Daniel's name was called, he stood. The room seemed to hold its breath. He walked unaided to the stage, guided only by the faint sound of Margaret's voice whispering from the wings, just 3 more steps, Daniel. He reached the piano bench, felt the polished wood beneath his fingers, and sat. The audience saw only a calm young man poised before the instrument, but those who knew his story understood they were witnessing a resurrection. He lifted the lid, took a deep breath, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment, one fragile heartbeat, he didn't move. Then, softly, he began. The first notes were simple, familiar, a reprise of the melody Margaret had once played the day they met. But it had grown. What began as a whisper of hope had evolved into something richer, layered with experience, pain, and grace. His music spoke in colors no one else could see. It carried the hush of empty hallways, the ache of absence, and the quiet defiance of love returning after being told it never could. Margaret sat in the front row, tears spilling unchecked down her cheeks. She had promised herself she would stay composed, but the moment Daniel smiled faintly mid-performance, she broke. Edward sat at the back, hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Every measure tore open a memory, Lydia's laughter, Daniel's silence, the night he'd locked the piano. But the music didn't accuse him, it forgave him. Every chord was a mercy he didn't deserve but was finally willing to receive. The melody swelled, filling the small hall with something that transcended words. At its heart was love, the love of a mother now gone, a father learning to begin again, and a maid who had never stopped believing that the quietest among us can heal the loudest wounds. When Daniel reached the final note, he let it linger, a single tone suspended in air like a soul refusing to fade. Then he lifted his hands, and silence fell. It wasn't the hollow silence that had once defined their lives. It was the silence of completion, the silence after prayer. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then swelling like the return of a long-lost heartbeat. Daniel bowed his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. He couldn't see the audience rise to their feet, but he could feel them. He could feel the vibrations of their gratitude, their awe, their love. He rose from the bench, tracing the edge of the piano one last time, then turned toward the sound of the applause. And from the very back of the room came a voice trembling with pride. "Well done, son." Daniel froze. He hadn't heard those words in nearly a decade. He didn't need to ask who had spoken. Edward stood, his eyes wet, his hands trembling, but his voice firm. "You did it." Daniel's expression broke into a radiant, unguarded smile. Margaret rose, clapping through her tears. The audience followed suit, their applause echoing through the hall until it felt as though the music had started. Again, this time, played by hearts instead of hands. Later that evening, when the hall had emptied and the sky outside blushed with dusk, the three of them stood alone on the stage. The piano gleamed beneath the warm lights, and the world beyond the tall windows seemed softened by rain. Daniel turned toward Margaret and reached out, finding her hand. "Thank you," he said simply. She squeezed his fingers. "No, Daniel. Thank you." Edward stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "You've brought this house back to life," he said. "And me with it." Daniel shook his head. "You just had to open the door, Father." Edward smiled faintly, the tears slipping free now without shame. "Then may it never close again." Margaret's gaze drifted to the piano, its keys reflecting the light like a line of small stars. "It won't," she whispered. And somewhere deep inside the building, perhaps only in their hearts, a faint echo answered her. The sound of music, not played but remembered, humming through time. That night, back at Haverstone Hill, Edward left the music room open as always. The moonlight spilled through the windows, catching the faint glimmer of fingerprints still pressed on the piano lid. He stood for a long moment, listening, not for silence this time, but for the gentle hum of life still moving within the walls. In the quiet, he could almost hear Lydia's voice, soft and certain, "You did it, Edward. You found someone who could teach him to feel." He smiled, whispering into the stillness, "No, my love. He taught us all." And as the moonlight fell across the keys, the house that had once been silent finally slept, alive, forgiving, and full of song.